Friends, I have a new book for you today, and it's called Don't Squeal Unless It's a Big Deal, A Tale of Tattletales. And it's by Jeannie Franz Ransom, and it's illustrated by Jackie Urbanovic. Wow, what do you think that's about? Let's find out. There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeil's class and 19 tattletales. Oh my gosh, look at all the crazy stuff happening in this class. Does it look like people are following rules and being kind? Pretty crazy stuff. It all started when Jessica trotted up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. Peter pulled my pigtail. That must have hurt, Mrs. McNeil said. Did you tell Peter that? Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeil said, Let's see what Peter has to say. Peter dragged his hooves all the way up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. Jessica says you pulled her pigtail, Mrs. McNeil said. I did not, Peter said. Yes, you did, Jessica said. You both have the right to say how you feel, Mrs. McNeil said. You also have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules like keep your hooves to yourself make it easier to do that. Mrs. McNeil added, but since Jessica's tail is still attached and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desk now. Jessica stomped. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeil started humming, The farmer in the dell, the farmer in the dell. Mrs. McNeil had just lifted her cup of slop for a quick slurp when Stephen trotted up. Rachel took my pink marker and she won't give it back. I even asked her 2 times. Mrs. McNeil put down her cup. Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself first by talking to Rachel, she said. Maybe her ears aren't working well today. Let's find out. That was good. He tried to talk to her first because that's the first thing to do when you have a problem with another student, right? Is to talk to them yourself. Stephen can't find his pink marker, Mrs. McNeil said. Have you seen it? I gave it back, Rachel cried. I can't find my pink marker. That's because you used it all up, Peter said. You're always drawing pictures of pigs. Rachel sniffed. For your information, those are pictures of moi. What am I supposed to do? Color myself green? You know our class rule, Rachel, said Mrs. McNeil. If you want to borrow something, ask first. It's how friends treat friends and stay friends. Well, that sounds like a really good rule, right? To ask, not just to take something. Sounds like a really good rule. Mrs. McNeil had just taken her first sip of slop when Megan announced, Frankie called Sookie a fat sow. Mrs. McNeil had to gulp her slop before she could speak. She cleared her throat and hoped she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. I'm glad you know our class rules so well, Mrs. McNeil said. You're right. We don't call each other names. Also, we don't try to fix problems that don't belong to us, Mrs. McNeil said. I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Sookie have a problem, it's their job to fix it. If they can't, it's my job as the teacher to help them. Your job, Mrs. McNeil added, is to take care of you. That's the most important job you can have. Megan danced a jig all the way back to her desk. But then, something more is going to happen. The stampede started. A stampede, friends, is when like a whole bunch of animals are running at the same time, all crazy. Robbie breathed on me. Jonathan ripped my paper. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Jeremy's grunting and I can't concentrate. Laura looked at me. Sam's picking his snout. Oh my gosh, way too many problems. Way too many problems. Some of those don't seem like a big deal. The students had practically worn a path to Mrs. McNeil's desk and worn out her patience when she stood up. The students sat down. Before we go to lunch, I think we need to add a new rule to our list, Mrs. McNeil said. A very important rule, she added. Can anyone tell me what squealing is? Students started squealing like their tails were stuck in a gate. Not that kind of squealing, Mrs. McNeil shouted, waving a cowbell. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeil continued. Squealing, she said, is my special word for tattling, and I know you know what that is. Let's find out. Some students looked at the floor. Some looked at each other. Some looked at the ceiling like they'd suddenly seen something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeil started writing on the board. Here's our new class rule, Mrs. McNeil said. What does it mean? Jessica asked. There it is. New class rule. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. I don't know if you can see the whole thing. I'm glad you asked, Mrs. McNeil said. To squeal on someone means you go tell a grown-up when someone does or says something you don't like, instead of telling the person first. Most problems that happen between kids are kid-sized problems. They can work out themselves, Mrs. McNeil said, usually by talking, listening, and helping each other. But sometimes, Mrs. McNeil said, something happens that's bigger than a kid-sized problem, like when someone is hurt or in danger, or when a person is hurting you, or hurting a pet, or hurting something that doesn't belong to them, or that belongs to all of us. See, look at some of these things. These do look like a big deal, right? Look, they drew on the principal's picture. They got a stick after a dog. They're kicking someone. That doesn't look good. That's when it's okay to squeal, because it's a big deal. When it's a big deal, it's an emergency. That's when you need to hoof it and get help from a grown-up. Oscar raised his hoof. I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeil, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack. Mrs. McNeil laughed. Me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we learn when we get back. Okay, that seems like a really good rule. Let's see what happens. But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeil had barely closed the classroom gate when Katie said, Jenny hogged the rope swing at recess. Mrs. McNeil pointed to the board. Remember what we just learned? Katie nodded. Then you know you need to tell Jenny first about the problem. Tell me what? Jenny yelled from across the room. That you were hogging the swing, Katie yelled back. You never asked for a turn, Jenny said. I didn't get a turn, Jeremy said. It's not my fault, Peter said. Not this time. It's Carolyn's fault, Sookie said. Who's Carolyn? Oscar asked. She's not even in our class, Frankie said. Oh my gosh, they're getting all upset. Thump. Mrs. McNeil had disappeared. Are you okay? Megan asked. Mrs. McNeil didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her tail was limp. One ear had something red on it. Quick, call the office. Tell them it's an emergency. Somebody get the nurse. Somebody tell Mrs. Hamlin next door. Oh, look, they're all worried about their teacher now. I hope you know you would go next door if something like that happened too. Later that afternoon, the students visited Mrs. McNeil in the nurse's office. We're sorry we squealed so much today, Jessica said. We didn't mean to make you mad, Peter said. It's all our fault, Katie cried. It wasn't anybody's fault, Mrs. McNeil said. It was an accident. I slipped on some spilled slop. It must have been quite a mess. We thought you had exploded, Jeremy said. It was pretty gross, Oscar added. Maybe you better not eat that stuff anymore, Rachel said. You need to take care of yourself. That sounds like it was an emergency, though. That was a big deal to go get her some help. It sounds like all of you took care of the problem, Mrs. McNeil said. Everyone says you knew just what to do when I got hurt. Only because you're such a good teacher, Jessica said. And you're such good learners, Mrs. McNeil said. We still need some practice, Katie said. We all do when we learn something new, Mrs. McNeil said. So let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. The end. All right. Hope you enjoyed the story. I'll talk to you soon.